Welcome to Silicon Curtain. I'm delighted to be joined today by Theodore Allthorpe-Mullis. We're going to be talking about Ukraine, obviously, but we're going to be talking about civic society and how, especially people from the West, UK, and Europe, get involved in helping Ukraine remain resilient. And this topic is extremely timely given the huge strikes on Kiev that happened just before we recorded the previous night, and people are still being pulled from the rubble of that. The US seems to have washed its hands of Ukraine, at least the Trump administration has. In some way, they slipped into the role of actively aiding and abetting Russia to commit its crimes. Unfortunately, even though that is not fully, I think, acknowledged yet by the media and perhaps by some Western politicians as well. So, before we get into this, note to the audience, please do check out the links in the video. We are crowdsourcing trucks, which we are 4x4 vehicles, which we hope to drive to Ukraine later in the year, over the summer. As we did in January this year, we've seen with our own eyes the tremendous work that gets done by the team in Lviv that repurpose these vehicles. We've also seen how these vehicles save lives. Some of them have already been destroyed and damaged on the front, but the crews and the soldiers in those vehicles were saved, not in their lives, but also their limbs were saved so they could continue fighting. So this is incredibly worthwhile. Please do help out if you can. Now, Theodore, welcome to the channel.
Oh, thank you very much for having me on, John. It's wonderful to be here.
And should we slip to Theo, or what are you comfortable with?
Theo is fine. Only one
Theo's
person calls
fine.
me Theodore, and that's when she's angry. So,
Yes. Okay, fantastic. Well, yeah, that's my son's name as well, but yeah, we never call him by the full name. Let's get in. Could you give a little bit of a description of what you do, and especially many people won't have heard of it because it's relatively new, but you are entering this arena of pro-Ukraine broadcasting. Please do tell us a few words about that and yourself.
I'm a journalist. I've been a journalist for just a few months now, really. Before I served 7 years in the Metropolitan Police, in uniform response, domestic violence investigations, missing persons, and then finally 2 years in human trafficking. I left to become more politically active. I saw the state of the world. Obviously, police, for very good reasons in the United Kingdom, cannot play any active roles in politics. And then I started three projects really. Dictators v Democrats is a Substack where I chart the struggle to defend democracy around the world. So that's Ukraine, that's the United States, that's here in Europe. That is, I mean, South Korea's been kicking off a fair bit recently over the past few months. There's the podcast, which is Dictators v Democrats, Why We Fight. And on that, I interview people who claim to be defending democracy. And I get their human story. I get why they do it. I get what their values are, what freedom and democracy mean to them, and what images conjure in their mind. It's everybody from somebody holding a placard at a protest to senior US officials coming up later in the month, or ex-senior US officials. The latest episode is with this amazing Georgian academic, politician, freedom fighter, really, Marika Mikiashvili. And she talks a lot about Georgia, which is, I think, now 202 days of straight protest since stolen elections by Georgian Dream last year.
Georgia is a fascinating case, isn't it? We've done about a dozen interviews with Georgian activists, analysts, experts in the last year. It's dropped from the headlines. In fact, it never really fully broke through into the headlines. And yet, it seems to me what's happened there is a classic example of kind of authoritarian backsliding. It's a classic example of state capture by the Kremlin using the full toolkit. Well, not the full toolkit because there are many aspects to that, but it's using a lot of the tools in the toolkit, which I think Russia has been actively exporting. And we can see elements of that state capture popping up all over the world. And I'd be fascinated to see, how you're digging into that. But Hungary, Serbia, Slovakia, there are numerous places, including the US itself,
Romania.
which Romania as well, showing signs of various stages and various, techniques being implemented for this authoritarian state capture process. What's your take on that? And do you think it's a sort of conscious toolkit that is built for export?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, it's built for export. We should have seen this coming a long, long time ago. In fact, there's an interview um, with the Chechen former president who was assassinated by the Russians, Dudayev, where he described it's prescient. He describes there'll be a massacre in Crimea. The Russians will retake it. There will be a huge conflagration between Russia and Ukraine, and the Russians will attempt to retake the old empire. And this is in '96 at the height of the First Chechen War. This is not something we should be surprised about. These tactics that we see Russia employ especially in a country like Georgia, which was a real bright star of the post-USSR states in terms of democracy, in terms of trying to move towards an actual civil society in the sort of Havel way, where you have people who are involved in the creation of something better rather than just existing. So we both saw last week Alexander Matvichuk describing the difference between the population and a citizen. The population who sits in their flat, whose will is dissipated. The authoritarians want them sat on their sofa, hypnotized by the television, and the citizen who takes an active role in civil society, who takes an active role in the future. And what this export does is it turns people from citizen to population, so that kleptocrats, so that populists can swoop in and essentially kill civil society off, which is what they're doing or attempting to do in Georgia. And at the moment, they have the state, but they don't have society. 202 days of straight protest. Society is saying, no, we don't want this. Sanctions can work because they're not a badge of honor amongst Georgian Dream. They are shameful, according to Marika, as does not accepting Georgian Dream's legitimacy. It
And
is, yeah, slowly working.
the regime again has a sense of impunity because I think it feels that it's got Russia at its back. But that's a dual-edged sword, isn't it? As long as they maintain their ability to suppress the protests with as much brutality as possible, Moscow will support them. They must also know that if at any point they weaken and appear to fall, then Moscow may adopt a very different approach. Now, of course, Russia is weakened, the Kremlin is weakened at this point. But if it was in full strength, then George Dream knows that if they don't do the dirty work of the Kremlin, they can expect a full invasion, potentially.
And ironically, this is what Georgian Dream came to power on the back of. They came to power on the back of the 2008 illegal invasion of Georgia, of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And the main manifesto was, "We will not let war come again." Uh, and to do that, they have sold their country down the river. Now, if you say to a Georgian Dream supporter, "You're backing Russia," or "You're backed by Russia," or "You're a Russian shill," that's actually a good way to start a fight in Georgia. It's such an anti um, Russian society, but Russia has still captured it, which is it displays the efficacy of their model. And we can see the model at use in Germany, we see it at use in Romania, how we see it at use in the UK, we see it at use in the US. Um, it's about turning people from citizens to population, from people who care to people who don't. And people who don't care are easily controlled.
This is also a debate that we have endlessly with people from the US, especially pro-Ukraine conservative Americans who I think many of whom are in the space at the moment where not all of Trump's antics appeal to them, absolutely. They may see the US as being weak in terms of its foreign policy towards Ukraine, but they don't buy into the idea that their state has been captured or is being hollowed out using these techniques. There is a sense of exceptionalism there. Yes, this happens to other places. Yes, Ukraine had Maidan, and we can absolutely see why they would do that. But no, it's not appropriate to us. And this could never happen here, and it hasn't happened here. I think one of the problems here is that people lump transitional stages of autocracy in with an established autocracy. And they look around and say, okay, we're not a dictatorship because we're not like that. We're not like Russia. We don't do X, Y, and Z. So it seems to me actually dividing out into transitional and fully fledged or established autocracy might be quite a useful experiment to do because it makes these kind of conversations easier. And it makes the idea of actually building some political action in the transition phase easier. Now, I don't know what your thoughts are there, but also we'll touch on action as well, because you're analyzing these autocratic slides, but ultimately you have come from a position of wanting to be a journalist, absolutely, but it seems to me that also you would not be content with not taking action. Well, let's start with the transitional versus established autocracy first.
I think it's an incredibly useful tool. I mean, we do the same on the flip side. We talk about flawed democracies and we talk about full democracies. Why would we not talk about transitional autocracies and full autocracies? Perfectly legitimate and logical to discuss this as a sliding scale rather than a flicking switch. You don't just you don't just become a democracy, nor do you become an autocracy overnight. It is something that takes work, it's something that takes time, and it's something that can be reversed. So if we are able to, if we use these terms, then we can more effectively direct our energies into, as you say, action. So yeah, the United States, I think, has moved over the last 10 years, give or take, from full democracy, which it really entered after the civil rights movement and after everybody got suffrage, to more and more of a flawed democracy. And it is inching towards a transition into greater authoritarianism. And Tim Schneider is saying this, and Applebaum is saying this. Those are two experts, far more knowledgeable than I, on autocracy and on democracy itself. So, yeah, it's useful. And we should recognize the signs. So, in the United States, you have a president who is actively hostile to large parts of civil society. He's hostile to academia. He's hostile to media and journalism. He's hostile to the idea of protest. He does not like it unless it's in his favor. And he's very much in favor of the military, despite having never served a day in his life in any organization that serves others. And he's very in favor of strongman acting. I mean, the guy is he's a TV guy, right? And those people have been extremely effective. He's been able to build a, a cult of personality around himself in a way that I thought you wouldn't see in the United States outside of a dead president, a
Well,
Lincoln or a Washington.
we'll come back to that because I think one of the important things here is, and why this state capture is being so effective is because the elements of cultish thinking and
Mm.
cult-like leadership, well, definitely, a personality cult. It's difficult for those who do not are not in favor of Trump's personality to think of it as a personality cult because he does not have the eloquence and charisma that we would normally associate with those things. Hitler, for all his flaws, which are legion, was an extraordinary orator. He was able to hack people's brains in a way that, even to this day, when you watch those clips, is quite remarkable. Even though we know what it led to, it's still quite mesmerizing to actually sort of watch those body movements and so on. He doesn't have that. for us because we're not his demographic. But he does seem to have that for those who do constitute his demographic. Um, you mentioned Anne Applebaum, you mentioned Timothy Schneider. Now, they are fantastic at the diagnosis, being able to pinpoint those moments of authoritarian slide. Do they, however, offer any solution or idea of how you actually constitute actions to go against it? I'm sort of guessing as journalists and academics, that's not quite their remit to offer concrete solutions, although they can and do analyze why Maidan was successful. I mean, there certainly is some
Mhm.
techniques there. What's your impression, and what do you feel as someone who, I mean, do you feel yourself as someone in action, someone who is not just in the business of diagnosis, but actually looking for a cure for the ills that we're talking about?
Yeah, action is vital, and I consider the kind of journalism that I do. It's not BBC journalism, and I will admit to a bias in that I think democracy is a lot better than autocracy. Um, as far as Applebaum and Schneider, well, Schneider certainly has a guide. And literally, he has a guide in on tyranny with its rules. Let me just see if I can find them briefly. Yeah, here we go. Yeah. So Schneider, he accurately diagnoses, and then he does offer some advice, which I would very much recommend to our audiences. Read on tyranny, especially if you are in the United States, especially if you are in a democracy that is beginning to slip. You can see the mistakes that are being made by organizations, by institutions. Rule number one is do not obey in advance. So all authoritarians, they rely in ways on seeing what they can get away with. And if you predict what they want and then act on it, well, then they're going to think, well, they already did this for me. So what else can I get away with? What else can I do? You saw that with the universities, except for Harvard, which is holding the line, Harvard. You saw that with a number of legal firms. They were bending the knee really before pressure was put on. Defend the institutions. Institutions are vital because they are not a single person. They have checks, they have balances, they have flaws, but without institutions, you will have little tyrannies of single minds running parts of your society. You'll have Gauleiters
And is
trying
that
to
the
interpret the will of the leader.
And is that the main, and when we see that happening, one, he's testing whether existing institutions, existing business leaders are willing to toe the line, even if
Mhm.
it goes precisely 360 degrees opposite to what they may have said in the past. We've got Jeff Bezos, we've got Zuckerberg and others who immediately genuflected before the new czar on his
Yeah.
coronation. And it seems that there's a continuous process of testing the limits of lawlessness, testing the limits of constitutionality, contesting the will of people to resist and, as you say, protect their institutions. So far, it seems almost universal abject failure to provide a barrier and a protection and a checks and balances. Has that surprised you? And what signs of resistance do you see?
Well, I was at the. I'll answer your second question first. I was at the No Tyrants protest outside the US Embassy in London. We can't call it No Kings on account of us having one. And his birthday parade was going on down the road. And it was all the US expats, US diaspora in the UK, some of whom happened to be on holiday here when this date fell and thought, well, I can't do nothing. And the No Kings marches across the United States, the organizers reckon 12 million, but let's halve that, 6 million. give or take, in 2,100 different locations, 200 odd thousand in New York, 100 odd thousand in Philadelphia. There was one little town that The Guardian quoted, a town population 800 with 400 at the local protest. So that to me, that is civil society being civil society. That is, as Schneider says, because I like to quote him, practicing corporeal politics. That is being there in person, being physical, getting out there, meeting new people, potentially making new friends, making contacts, making allies, and that gives me hope. The actions of some of the courts also gives me hope. It is, after all, their job as a co-equal part of the government in the United States Constitution to check and balance the power of the other branches, particularly at this moment, the executive. And there's an extremely dangerous narrative coming out of the executive's mouthpieces saying, well, the president can't govern if the courts shut him down. The courts are shutting him down because he is governing or attempting to in an illegal manner. And that's the court's job as laid out by the founding fathers in the US Constitution. It's really quite simple. And this is exactly what it was designed for. As for my disappointment, yes, I am disappointed in a lot of institutions. I'm disappointed um, in private institutions like some of the universities, like the law firms. I'm disappointed. I'm very disappointed in the media, but I've been disappointed in I hate the term mainstream media because I think it when you hear somebody say that, you ought to be slightly suspicious. But I'm disappointed in the media for initially giving the man far too much airtime in 2015, 2016, and now also for towing the line. I'm disappointed in ABC for firing a journalist for something he said on his private Twitter account. Again, that is obeying in advance. And the it is the job of the press to hold power to account. It's kind of the job of the press to annoy people to a certain degree, especially if they are people who wear expensive suits and make big decisions in smoke-filled rooms. The whole point of the press is to try to get an eye in those rooms and to make sure that they are being honest and above board. And the press has, in the United States at least, with some excellent exceptions, failed to do this and towed the line too much. And there have been some legislative changes uh, decades back which really towed the path or laid the groundwork for this.
But if journalists, if individual journalists do not have the support of their editors, the support of their institution, they're essentially, forced to make that choice, really to go solo, or to toe the line. And do you think that's what's happening here? The institutions are not working, and no one wants to be the first to break cover because they don't see a sort of supportive swell of other people going along with them.
Yeah, it's very hard to break cover. Um, it's part of the reason why I left the police. I broke cover and I wrote an email that resulted in me sat behind a desk doing Excel spreadsheets. And it's difficult to do that. And it's difficult to do that, especially when you have a mortgage or kids. But there are 12 million max people who decided to go out and protest in cities across the United States. And there is still civil society, strong civil society in the US that doesn't want the United States to turn into a kleptocratic mess like Russia or like Hungary. So, yes, it's difficult. Yes, editors are failing because editors are getting pressure from the owners. The owners already bent the knee, as we saw at the coronation. Freudian slip, as, as we saw at the inauguration. So, yes, it's difficult.
I'm not even sure
If
it's a slip. I mean, he is clearly
Mm,
aspiring to be a monarch. May be the wrong thing because I don't think he would model himself on a constitutional monarch in any way.
no.
And I think when people say no kings, they miss the distinction there between a constitutional monarch that operates within and is bound by a complex set of culture, tradition, and law and precedent, and someone that clearly seems to feel that no such rules or culture bind him in any way whatsoever.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, the various definitions between different types of monarchy. I vacillate wildly as a Briton between uh, a sort of nostalgic enjoyment of the monarchy and questioning why, as a Democrat, I kind of like it, um, and also questioning why we have it in the first place. I haven't made my mind up about the British monarchy, but with the kind of no kings works in the US because of their history. But it is more no tyrants, and it's no kleptocrats, it's no oligarchs. These are some of the most dangerous and unpleasant people around today. They are the ones that are actively undermining democracy for motivations as base as pay less tax. And it's cruel, it's unpleasant, it's pathetic, and it is deeply selfish. And I'm going to get a little bit red here, but I sometimes wonder if there's something in the psychology when somebody gets an enormous, ungodly amount of money that seems to make quite a lot of them quite bad people. Uh, because it could make you an amazingly brilliant person. You could be lauded for giving enormous amounts of money to charity for funding technologies which could save our world from its most pressing problem of climate change. But they seem to want to pour money into political campaigns to ensure they pay less tax and build rockets to take celebrities into space. It's that again a little bit red. They remind me of Romanovs. I must say for the audience, I am not a socialist.
You're sounding like a communist to me. No, no,
No.
joking there. No, I'm also perhaps more close to the Republican side than you are, in that I feel it's an institution which is fully reliant on the capabilities of the monarch. And if it's someone like Queen Elizabeth, it's extraordinarily intelligent, diplomatic, and extremely knowledgeable, as well as experienced, then the institution is only as strong as the incumbent. But then one could say that about almost all human institutions. The
Yeah.
American Constitution, the presidency, etc., only has the authority, gravitas, and impact that is commensurate with the holder of that title. And the current one, who is, in my view, debasing that institution. He's not just sort of damaging and actually hollowing out and destroying institutions and political culture in the US. The G7 shows that he's doing that on the international stage, rendering international organizations, I would say, hollow and ineffective. He's just pulled out of the G7. He's left early. He has not signed any kind of communique that had been drafted around Israel, and it was a pretty soft communique anyway. It didn't
Yeah.
really commit to
Yeah.
much at all. And the only statement of any meaning he seems to have made was to bemoan the absence of his friend, the mass murderer, Vlad, from Moscow.
Mm.
It's an extraordinary spectacle. And of course, a lot of the media, I won't say mass media here, but a lot of media focuses on the theatrics of these. But in reality, what he's doing is destroying the power of these institutions to affect change, unity, and ultimately any trust the public may have in them.
Well, he's been undermining trust in institutions since the start of his first campaign. That was a big part of the platform that he ran on, and it resonated because people's lives have not improved in the way that they were expected to over the last few decades, because economic mistakes were made and far too much wealth was placed in the hands of far too few people. Him being one of those people, of course, and his supporters, his significant supporters in these smoke-filled rooms being some of those people as well. So it's quite I think this is the one of the core things that explains the rise of anti-democratic populism, is the perceived failure of liberal democracy to improve lives over the last 30 to 40 years, really since Reagan. I mean, if we get the golden age of this, I say the golden age, take that one with a big old pinch of salt because there are significant flaws and failures, was when we had a very high tax rate on the very wealthy, where we had a very strong welfare state, and when aspiration was possible. People have, especially in the United States, lost sight of the difference between different kinds of freedom. The freedom from the government means nothing if I am not free from illness. Freedom from government intervention means very little if I am too poor to be able to exercise any other freedom, to move, um, to grow, to start a business, for example. If I'm too broke to start a business, then I can't improve. I can try to get a job and save, but if that job barely pays my way as it is, then where do I go? I'm stuck. I stagnate. I see the television saying I can get this. Uh, it fills me with aspiration that is unachievable. And then it's quite easy to take somebody like that and push them towards really voting against their own interests by making it easy and by providing very easy solutions to difficult problems, like Trump has done. And Trump has also spoken to an unfortunate part of the American psyche, which is unfortunately quite racist and has a streak of sadism running through it. There's a reason why the last time, I mean, he just deployed the National Guard over Newsom's will. The last time that happened was in the 60s to enforce civil rights legislation in, I think it was Alabama. And that attitude that was present in Alabama then still has not left parts of the United States. And the idea that because somebody else has it worse than me, I can feel a little bit better. That's not freedom. That is actively making you unfree. And people are manipulating that.
Let's touch on your personal motivations, because not only are you doing these sort of journalistic broadcast activities to try and sort of get us out of the hole that we've fallen into, or got ourselves into, you are you are taking action. You have been to Ukraine, seen things with your own eyes. It's a key part of what you do is, I would say, bearing witness to what we're seeing here. Could you describe to the audience, what, if, well, as much detail as you can or feel comfortable providing about your trips to Ukraine and what you saw there?
So the first time I went to Ukraine was really a sort of a taster, and I stumbled across the legendary war correspondent John Sweeney in a pub in Soho, and me and my friend Andrew sort of mildly accosted him, and I managed to get his email address,
So what
and
are the chances of finding John in a bar? I mean,
slim.
that's
Oh,
yeah.
yeah, finding John in a bar. That's the only place people meet John. But yeah, no, he recommended that I come out to Ukraine, and I did. What I saw in Ukraine was I've just come back from about 2 months there, staying with a friend, staying with the volunteers, going to the front and dropping off vehicles. And I must say, for your fundraiser, for your audience, vehicles are ammunition in Ukraine. They are absolutely expendable. Any vehicle you send will last 2 or 3 months, but they are needed. They are desperately needed. Uh, they save lives. They help the Ukrainians hold the zero line. And if you've got £5 or $5 to give to John's campaign, then do it. Spare the coffee and help them get a truck. But what I saw in Ukraine was the work of freedom, and it's a people who have lived under tyranny since time immemorial. You, the Ukrainians are have chosen to be free, to break free of an empire which has held them under their thumb for centuries. And I saw enormous resilience and I saw enormous pain. I saw everything from teenagers at a school saying that we're never going to give up. And then the air alert went off and they all had to go to the shelter. Soldiers at the front line. There was one I met who was a Hare Krishna, um, and it admitted that it kind of contradicted with the fact that he's a drone operator and well has to kill the invader. It just I saw a society that for a very long time had been shattered. And I forget what it's called, the Japanese tradition of when you smash a pot, you rebuild it and you fill the cracks in with gold. Ukraine reminds me of that. And this conflagration, this genocidal conflict, which it's defending itself against, is making Ukraine simultaneously suffer an enormous amount, but it is making it stronger. Ukrainian identity, Ukrainian society is now proud and strong. And for a country which a couple of decades ago, most people would have confused with the imperialist neighbor to the north, Russia, it is one of the most, I'd say actually, no, it is the most important country in the world at the moment. Um, and it is distinct. So I saw I mean, it's a war. You see every part of the human condition. I saw mass graves in Izium and very, very small coffins there. And I saw hope and defiance and, yeah, and despair. But Ukraine is the front line of the fight to defend democracy around the world. There are many different fronts, and this is how I write about this in all of my work. I couch it in the language of conflict because it is a conflict and it is coordinated by the autocracies, in one camp by oligarchs and billionaires who don't like democracy, in another. Um, and Ukraine is really where it's one of the places where it's coming to a head. And Ukraine may be where the future of the world order is decided between an order where might does not make right, and we have an attempt, a flawed and often not very effective attempt at international norms and rules, or the kind of world where we return to the 19th century, classical realism in international affairs, zero sum games, and constant small wars over patches of land, in which most people will become tools. And this is something that Schneider quotes Saint Edith Stein, the difference between the person as um, an object, the Körper, and the person as the individual that can grow, the Lieb, the Leib, I forget how to pronounce it in the German. Autocracies make us objects. War makes us objects. Democracy, freedom, when we work at it, when we're effective at it, we can be much more than an object. We can be Lieb, which is, again, the body that can grow, that can experience, that can love, that can suffer, but that can be made stronger through the sufferance. That's what I saw in Ukraine. Rather a lot.
It's a lot, isn't it? And people will be thinking, well, oh goodness me, this must be depressing. And I know the reaction of many people because many of my friends, they know about the podcast. They may even have tuned into a few episodes, but many people are just thinking this is relentless. War, chaos is relentless, and people tend to shy away eventually from the headlines because they're just screaming too loudly. And if they don't have some way through, if they don't have a solution, if they're not in action, then actually this stuff is extremely damaging to mental health. But it seems to me that actually when you focus in, and as you have gone to Ukraine, then you start realizing that actually it's uplifting in many ways to see the extraordinary resilience, to see not just, as a sort of blind resilience, but people who know they're going to win, people who have tools to help them win, um, and people who have an understanding that the civic society and the behaviors that have been sort of evolving over hundreds of years, but of course have bounded back since independence, they believe they're not just going to win out of sort of some kind of blind faith, but because they have the tools and the culture to win. I find that when you start to engage with that, then the news headlines become less affecting in the way, less debilitating. They don't steal your agency. I want to dig into that, this idea that the media as it's currently constructed, on balance, is more damaging for people's agency than it is in stimulating them to solve the problems that are being talked about.
Yes. Especially social media. Social media is big oil and big tobacco. It's as dangerous as those two. It is very, very, very manipulative. And it's able to take a good mind, a strong mind, a healthy mind, and through constantly giving it essentially mental cocaine, what it wants, what you want to feel, and strong emotion, outrage, it weakens your ability to think critically. That's why like many in my position, have to be very active on platforms like X. I don't like X particularly, especially don't like the chap that runs it. But I will try and make an effort, an active effort, to seek out those I disagree with and engage with them. Sometimes it doesn't work out. I've been blocked by at least one significant professional contrarian in the UK who will remain nameless, so I don't get sued. But it's it's difficult. It's really difficult because most people are not. I'm a weird political nerd. Um, and I've dedicated my life to this. Most people cannot. Most people don't have the time. You don't have the time to be a disinformation expert. You don't have the time to be a fact checker. You don't have the time to pass and check whether or not the algorithm is just feeding you what you want to hear, which is why social media is so dangerous and why we really absolutely need an international convention on it, at least in countries like the the European area or the EU, which hopefully we join soon. But yeah, the media as it is, especially social media, is set up in such a way that it is making us less free. As for the traditional media, television programs, especially those like, well, Fox News, Newsmax, or um, in the United States, again, are set up to turn us from citizens to population, to make us so outraged and so upset that we get lost in, well, essentially get hypnotized and don't act when the time comes or when we might have before. So there is quite a lot wrong with today's media. The primary guilty party in this is the major social media companies. Because, okay, take this. So there's a jingle that I use in my podcast, and it's I downloaded it perfectly legally, etc., but it is flagged for copyright, right? And it's maybe total of 15 seconds it plays in an hour-long episode. And yet the social media companies are able to find that, but they are not able to find and track dis and misinformation, or they refuse to because it is profitable. And because the people that run a lot of these social media companies agree with a chunk of it. So they have a lot to answer for, and they are dangerous and effectively should be treated as a critical infrastructure because we need to communicate. And in this day and age, social media is an important part of society. And if they're treated as a critical infrastructure, they should be regulated and monitored as such.
So, in the diagnosis, I mean, I can't fault the diagnosis you're making here. I think these are many of the issues that we are experiencing as you develop your journalistic and indeed media output. What are your plans in terms of moving from diagnosis to cure? And how do you plan to sort of build up your presence and create a unique identity and voice in what is, let's face it, a crowded space? It's something we're all perhaps daily struggling with.
Yeah, so I am at the moment I have this triptych of Dictators v Democrats, which is my written work you can find on my Substack. That is uh, commentary pieces, a weekly roundup in the major news about democracy and the threats to it globally. I have the Why We Fight podcast, which you can also find on my Substack as well as Spotify, etc., YouTube. And that is the conversations with the freedom fighters and getting why they do it. And Terra Firma, where I discuss the environment and the climate crisis, because you can't have democracy on a dead world. You can't have liberty on a dead world. And with the tone and the voice, I there are so there are as you say, it's a crowded market. There are a lot of people talking about this, but a lot of that is focused in a circle, and I want to break out of that, and I want to speak to people who don't understand why people fight for democracy or freedom. I want to speak to people who don't necessarily think that there's a threat to democracy around the world. And I especially want to speak to the Zillennial audience where I can find them, which is why I've got a Discord set up. It's a bit of a big empty house at the moment, but who get their might not be politically engaged, but are hearing a lot of political opinions from Fortnite streamers, from fitness influencers, and from essentially hobbyist streams that are not necessarily in the political space, and they're not really being talked to. And unfortunately, I have a sneaking suspicion that some of those streamers might be getting some money to talk about certain issues in a certain way. And that is dangerous. So we're seeing especially the Zoomer audience and the Zoomer audience, the Zoomer citizens split now between going to the very far left or to the very far right, which is extremely dangerous. because neither of those sides have the answers. So it's about reaching an audience which is perhaps younger, which is perhaps not as politically involved, and also keeping it more, I guess, casual. A lot of the commentary on this is quite difficult and is quite can be quite opaque. If you are not already politically interested. If you are, then a lot of it's fantastic. But that's the kind of thing I want to hit. And it's recognizing a duck for a duck. Democracy is at war. And that's the language that I use. I describe areas as fronts. So we have the British front, the American front, the Ukrainian front, because they are. Um, and it's putting a spine in democracy. Far too many people, in my opinion, are coy about uh, the value of democracy, a little bit slightly embarrassed when I think, oh yeah, democracy is good. Okay, I mean, it is. It's excellent, and it's the best system that we've been able to come up with. All of the other ones tend to lead to oceans of blood or kind of an unpleasant life. Democracy is the one that's pulled the most people out of poverty. Democracy has given most has is the one to really enshrine human rights and values. And we should recognize that sometimes democracy needs to be defended, and sometimes it needs to be defended with force, and we shouldn't shy away from that. So
That's an
it's
interesting one. I mean, that's one I think we'll have to pick up again because I'd love to do an episode on, Maidan and the power of force in that sense. When you well, let's tackle it now because we've got a few minutes left.
yeah, yeah.
Um, Speaking to a Belarusian dissident, they reached out to the US during the protests against Lukashenko, when there was a huge sort of, civic coming together, peaceful protest against an extremely violent, oppressive regime. And it failed. It failed for a number of reasons. One was that Russia was able to bus in propagandists and shore up the regime with paramilitary forces, with advisors, with propagandists, and so on, plug the gaps in a disintegrating regime. The other one is the extreme violence that the regime was able to deploy. And thirdly, they had a very clever strategy, which was not to say, we're right and good, but to say, yeah, we're the bad guys, but what are you going to do about it? And they were able to make people feel isolated, right? You may believe that you are right, and you're fighting for these things you believe, but you're on your own. No one's coming to your aid. So when these protesters reached out to the US, they were told, yes, yes, we'll support you, and up to the hilt, except we don't want any Maidans. We don't want any violence whatsoever. We don't want any hard pushback against the regime. You carry along the path of peaceful resistance and we'll be with you. The minute it sort of starts to resemble what Ukraine did, I'm afraid we part ways. That was the implication of the tone that came from the US. My view is that they, through that, were condemning these protests to absolute failure. Because it seems that during Maidan, what you were able to have was people from across the spectrum, right across the political spectrum, from sort of hard left to even hard right, and every shade in between, were able to agree that they had certain things in common. And one of those things was not to be massacred by the paramilitarized secret police. And the only way to resist that was to put up a certain amount of spirited resistance, i.e., meet in certain circumstances violence with violence. That's a topic which I think a lot shy away from. Now, having been in the police, I imagine you can kind of sort of see problems advocating for violence, but maybe in certain circumstances it's the only way to protect freedom. What are your thoughts on that complex issue?
Well, when you mentioned the police, in the police, I learned that sometimes the only way you can deal with a violent bully is to punch them in the face quite hard. Um, and on violence, a fantastic book. All of your audience should read it by Hannah Arendt. Um, Violence is not power. Violence is the failure of power. Power is a contract that the people overall can withdraw. In Maidan, the people of Ukraine withdrew their consent to be governed. And the same happened in Belarus. Maidan worked because the people were able to follow that up. And when they started getting massacred, they resisted. Non-violent resistance does work, and it has worked in counter-imperial campaigns before, as has violent resistance. And it there is no answer as to the situation, which one will work and which one won't. But I don't think we should be coy about defending liberty, defending freedom, defending human rights uh, with violence if necessary. Violence is one tool in a toolkit, and occasionally it must be used. When you go to the Ukrainian front line, they are using force. They are closing with and killing the enemy. And that is done to further the cause of Ukrainian freedom against a genocidal, autocratic, imperialist invader. I still see certain sections of the West shy away from this fact because they are squeamish about it. But it hits very different when the shaheeds are going over your bed. And it hits very different when you can hear the explosions nearby. So no, it needs sometimes to be used. And in a war, in an invasion, yeah, you need to use violence. In fighting an autocracy, in essentially a resistance movement, you may have to. Uh, it's not always going to work. It might even work against you at times. It depends on the situation that you're in. So I don't know. I can't predict whether or not if the Belarusians had been able to use more force against Lukashenko, if there would have been a Maidan. But I do know that Maidan was successful. And unfortunately, tragically, Belarus is still suffering and starving under the boot of the autocrats.
Yes, and those who weren't able to get out of the country, um, and who were apprehended are, I mean, goodness only knows what physical and mental torments they will have gone through at the hands of the regime. Um, it seems to me sometimes the price, you have to be able to imagine the price that's going to be paid in slow, eked out violence inflicted by the regime compared with the short, sharp violence you may need to employ to push back against a regime and prevent yourself and your um, fellow protesters from being, say, kidnapped, tortured, murdered even by the regime. I think it's difficult in democracies. It's difficult, especially in the US, which has
Yeah.
never undergone that process or, been ruled by a dictator, to imagine those circumstances where you have these difficult sort of moral slash political questions and choices. I think that's one of the challenges we've got at the moment.
Well, I would argue that the United States has faced microcosms of this. Um, the Pinkertons strike breaking violence that had to be used to defend miners in Harm County. And of course, you have the US, the American Civil War, where liberty fought against slavery. And to anybody who thinks that the American Civil War was about slavery, I ask them to read the Constitution of the CSA. You'll find it's copy paste, but for a couple lines. So the United States has had to go through similar things. It's never gone through what I would call absolute autocracy or and revolution only once. But uh, were I placed in the 1850s and 60s, I'd like to think that perhaps John Brown would have been a friend.
There, I think we're going to have to bring this conversation, unfortunately, to a stop. But I look forward to the next one and digging into some of these
Absolutely.
issues. And of course, being along there for the journey as you grow and expand your audience, and of course, the ambition of your journalistic slash sort of publishing
Yeah.
experience.
So thank you very much for having me on. Thank you very much indeed. My Substack, I post regularly, at least a couple of times a week. The weekly roundup is every Sunday. The podcast is released every Friday. And is it okay to plug the
It certainly is. Plug away.
paid elements? Okay. Um, you can be a free subscriber. You'll get everything. If you want to be a paid subscriber and support my work, you'll have early access to the podcast. You have 1 week's early access to that. And on Patreon, there are further tiers. Substack only gives you 1 or 2 tiers, unfortunately. There is also a Discord, which you can find on my Substack, on my Patreon, and on my Buy Me a Coffee, which is a big empty house at the moment. But if you want to come, if you want to discuss the war against democracy, if you want to discuss ways to defend democracy, then come along and we can have some chats there. But big things in the future, more YouTube stuff, more YouTube channels, merchandise will be coming, and hopefully the aim to remind people of the value of our freedom and remind people the value of our democracy and remind people that democracy is non-negotiable.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Theo. We'll speak soon.
Thank you very much. See you soon.